Days before Christmas in 2022, a United Airlines Boeing 777 careens towards the ocean just seconds after takeoff from Hawaii. Alarms blare in the cockpit, but the pilots are utterly confused as to what is happening. Will they be able to pull their massive plane out of its terrifying dive, or is it already too late for them under 271 passengers? This is a story of confusion distraction. And above all, it's a story about what can happen when our expectations don't match reality. This is the story of United Airlines Flight 1722. Before proceeding, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thank you. On the afternoon of December 18, 2022, 271 passengers and 10 crew boarded a United Airlines Boeing 777 at Maui's Kahului Airport in Hawaii. They were bound for San Francisco, a 5-hour journey across the blue expanse of the Pacific Ocean. A lot of these kinds of videos, even some of my own, talk about how the ill-fated flight in question started out just as any other, that always routine and so on, but with Flight 1722, that was not the case. In fact, by the time the pilots had reached the aircraft that afternoon, they already knew that they were in for an unusual departure before even arriving at the airport. The captain had received a thorough briefing from the dispatcher about the severe weather which had been battering the island. So bad was this weather that as the first officer was carrying out his external inspection of the aircraft, he received a text message from a friend telling him that another aircraft on its way into Honolulu that morning had declared an emergency. After experiencing turbulence so severe that the pilots had temporarily lost control of their aircraft, when that plane finally landed, 20 passengers were taken to hospital, 11 of whom were in serious condition. In other words, from the very outset of this flight, the pilots knew that things were a little out of the ordinary when they reached the aircraft. They told the flight attendants that they should remain seated throughout the climb for their own safety. The captain of Flight 1722 had been with United Airlines for years now. Aged 55, he had accumulated almost 20,000 flying hours, 5,000 of which were in the Boeing 777. 20,000 hours is a lot even for a pilot of his age. Before upgrading to the position of 777 captain, he had spent a few years as a captain on United's short-haul Airbus fleet, and this switch from Airbus to Boeing will end up being an important consideration. In the events which we're about to see, the first officer by comparison was new to United Airlines, and new to the 777, he had just 120 hours on the aircraft and just over 5,000 hours on all planes in total. Before joining United, he had been with Hawaiian Airways, and he was familiar enough with the weather around Hawaiian Islands to know that this day was particularly rough. At about 2:30 that afternoon, Flight 1722 pushed back from the gate at Maui. The 271 passengers settled in for the 5-hour journey to San Francisco. Despite the weather, they had every reason to believe that they were in safe hands. United Airlines and the Boeing 777 both had excellent safety records. The passengers had no idea that just moments after takeoff, things would start to go very wrong in the cockpit as the captain taxied through the lashing rain out to runway 02 at Maui. He and the first officer discussed the weather they would be facing once they got airborne. The real danger on this day was not the rain, but the wind, or more specifically wind shear. Wind shear is a dangerous weather phenomenon, whereby the wind rapidly changes its speed or direction. Over a short distance, it can be deadly to aircraft, because the whole reason planes fly in the first place is by going fast enough through the air that the air can support them. If the wind suddenly starts coming from behind the aircraft, its speed can get so slow that it simply falls out of the sky like a dead weight. If this happens low to the ground, like just after takeoff, there may not be enough room for the pilots to save their aircraft. And sure enough, as the pilots made their way to the runway, the controller relayed that he had received multiple reports from pilots of low-level wind shear, that is, wind shear close to the ground. This phenomenon has taken many lives over the years. The pilots run high alert. Prepare for a possible encounter with a phenomenon. The captain briefed the first officer on the wind shear escape maneuver, which involved pushing the engines to maximum thrust and pulling the plane's nose to 15 degrees above the horizon, They fully expected that they may have to carry out this maneuver after takeoff, but preparing for wind shear involves more than just carrying out briefings as well as this. The captain decided to extend the flaps to 20 degrees for the takeoff. Generally, 777 pilots use flap 15 for takeoff, but on this day the extra notch of flaps would give the plane an additional margin of safety, allowing it to fly more slowly if the wind suddenly changed on top of this. He opted to use maximum power for takeoff rather than the reduced power setting normally used to save wear and tear on the engines. He would need every ounce of power he could get for this takeoff as far as the story of Flight 1722 goes. This flap and thrust setting is not just a minor detail. Rather, it will play a crucial part in the events which we're now about to see. At about 2:45 that afternoon, the captain lined the massive 777 up on the runway. He put the windshield wipers on high and turned on the weather radar, which scanned a cone-shaped section of sky in front of and above the aircraft, and the picture it painted told him that things wouldn't get easier. Once he was airborne, the two pilots were now poised to go. Strapped to the wings of their 777 were the two most powerful jet engines ever built, giving almost 4 Titanics worth of thrust once he had received takeoff clearance. The captain spooned the engines up to their maximum thrust setting, unleashing this incredible power. Things were now about to happen really quickly, way more quickly, in fact, than the pilots were used to. Within moments, the engines, soaking in 7 metric tons of air per second, powered the aircraft to its takeoff speed of about 260 kilometers per hour. The captain pulled back in his control column and lifted the plane into the murky sky for the first few seconds. The climb was normal. As expected, the pilots saw that their airspeed was fluctuating. This meant that the air was becoming more unstable. The captain was primed to carry out the winter escape maneuver at a moment's notice while he flew the plane. The first officer was busy acting as the so-called pilot. Not flying in this role, his duties were to handle radio communications with air traffic control to monitor the captain's flying and to clean up the aircraft as it climbed out. Cleaning up the aircraft involves things like raising the gear and the flaps to make the plane more streamlined for high-speed flight after many hours of flying the same aircraft. Pilots settle into a kind of a rhythm for this process. There is a cadence they come to expect in terms of what's called the flap retraction schedule, but on this flight, because the pilots were using maximum engine power and flaps 20. This rhythm had been thrown off, and the pilots, with their focus centered on the possibility of wind shear, were not ready to face that. As the plane reached about 1,000 feet, the captain lowered the nose slightly to allow the aircraft to accelerate. But if the plane got too fast, as indicated by these red markers here, the force of the air would damage the flaps. To prevent this, and to allow the plane to accelerate further, the captain told the first officer to raise the flaps, and it is here where things started to go wrong. Pilots normally use flaps 15 for takeoff on the 777, and they're used to retracting them 1 notch at a time, first to flaps 5, then to flaps 1, and then fully up. But according to the Boeing 777's manuals, when taking off with flaps, 20 pilots should first retract the flaps 2 notches directly to flaps 5 and to bypass flaps 15 altogether. But on this flight, it's disputed whether the captain told the first officer to raise the flaps to 15 degrees or to 5 degrees. The captain thought he had said flaps 5, while the first officer thought he said fast 15. In any case, as the plane accelerated, the first officer raised the flaps by 1 notch to 15 degrees and then contacted departure control on the radio. This miscommunication about the flap setting was fundamentally a pretty minor one. After all, it would only be a few moments before the captain would tell the first officer to move the flaps up to the next notch. But what made this error so insidiously consequential is that the captain now had a completely false picture in his head about the plane's configuration. His expectations were now diverging from reality, and the confusion this would create would now endanger the lives of all 281 people on board. When the first officer raised the flaps to 15 degrees, the red overspeed markings on the captain's primary flight display only went up by a few knots. Look here, a flaps 20. The captain couldn't fly faster than 190 knots without risking damage to their flaps. When the first officer raised the flaps to 15 degrees, The overspeed section only went up by 20 knots to about 210 knots, meaning that the captain would risk damaging the flaps if he just went 20 knots faster. The captain was expecting this red overspeed section to go up significantly, because with flaps 5, which he thought he had called for, it takes a lot more speed to cause damage to the flaps. So now the captain was in a situation where his plane was accelerating and was about to go too fast for the flaps. He didn't understand why this was happening. Was there a problem with the flaps? Were the violent wind conditions outside playing a role? To prevent the plane from going too fast, he pulled back and the thrust lever slightly. But this only helped so much. The plane continued to accelerate as all of this was happening. The first officer was dialing in the air traffic controller's clearance for the flight to climb to an altitude of 16,000 feet. The controller also told him that there was heavy rain in every direction around the aircraft and that he could deviate as needed to avoid the weather. But just as the first officer was focusing on the weather and the instructions from the controller, the captain's confusion was growing. The plane had started to exceed the safe speed limit for the flaps. The captain quickly checked the flap indicator on his central display and saw that they were set not at 5 degrees as he had recalled asking for, but at 15 degrees. He immediately told the first officer to retract the flaps to 5 degrees, which he then did. But this didn't solve the problem. In fact, the plane kept accelerating deep inside the clouds with no way to see outside their plane. There was only one way for the pilots to see the terrifying truth. Their primary flight display here showed that their aircraft was beginning to pitch down. In fact, its nose had just begun to dip below the horizon. Their 777 had started to enter a rapid descent, and this is where we return to a small detail I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, which may not be such a small detail after all. The captain of Flight 1722 had been flying Airbus aircraft for United Airlines for a few years before switching to the Boeing 777. A big difference between Boeing and Airbus aircraft is in how they handle pitch inputs from the pilots on an Airbus plane when a pilot wants to reduce the pitch attitude from, say, 10 degrees nose up to 5 degrees nose up. They simply push their side stick forwards until the plane is at 5 degrees pitch altitude and return the side stick to neutral. The plane will then maintain that pitch attitude all by itself. For this reason, Airbus aircraft are said to be pitch stable, but Boeing aircraft like the 777 are not pitch stable. They do not automatically maintain the pitch attitude set by the pilots. What this meant for Flight 1722 is that as the captain focused his attention on the central display, trying to see whether there was a problem with the flaps, he was, without realizing it, easing his control column forwards towards the neutral position in an Airbus. This would be no problem, as the plane would maintain the pitch attitude he had previously said. But in the Boeing 777, this more neutral control input allowed the plane's nose to lower in all probability in the stressful and unfamiliar situation. The captain simply reverted to basic flying instincts he had been honing for years on Airbus aircraft, and without realizing it, he allowed the plane's nose to drop. The first officer saw the plane's nose dropping, but he was confused. Clearly the captain was having trouble controlling the plane's airspeed, as the overspeed warning was still sounding. But what about the pitch of the plane? Why did the captain appear to be lowering the plane's nose and putting it into a dive? Could the first officer's instruments be broken? The captain was also perplexed. He was hyper-fixated on the overspeed warning and trying to diagnose its cause. The plane was now more than 20 knots faster than it should have been going, and the flaps were at serious risk of being damaged. Second by second, the nose got lower, and the plane's descent quickened. The captain ordered the first officer to retract the flaps further to 1 degree, completely oblivious to the true cause of his ever-increasing speed. He was now inadvertently beginning to push the nose over, powering the massive plane towards the ocean below. The first officer retracted the flaps to 1 degree, but the warning continued. He was utterly confused. What was the captain doing with the plane? Why was he overspeeding it? And yet keeping the engines nearly at climb thrust, was the storm causing the plane to behave in this way? Were his instruments wrong? He looked over at the captain's instruments, but they told the same story as his own. The plane was now in a dramatic nose-down position, pointing more than 10 degrees below the horizon and ascending at a horrific rate of 8,000 feet per minute. At this rate, they will plunge into the ocean in less than 10 seconds. In the cabin, the passengers were oblivious to what was happening up front. They didn't know that their lives were now in grave danger, not because of turbulence, but because of a terrible confusion. Up in the cockpit, the massive plane screamed down through the clouds, diving for the ocean below. Just at that moment, as the first officer was looking over at the captain, he caught sight out of the corner of his eye of a cloud moved rapidly past the aircraft, to both pilots' horror. They were now face to face with the Pacific Ocean. They were powering towards it at a speed of more than 550 kilometers per hour. The first officer shouted the captain to pull the plane off. Captain had mere seconds to react. He yanked back in his control column, heaving the gargantuan aircrafts. In the result, he quickly pulled the power back to idle to allow the plane to round this vertical corner as quickly as possible. The passengers and crew were pressed violently into their seats as the plane bottomed out just 750 feet from the surface of the ocean. The length of the 777 is 210 feet. Flight 1722 was less than 4 times its own length from smashing into the Pacific Ocean. The terrain alarm sounded loudly in the cockpit, alerting the pilots that they were just moments away from colliding with the sea. They watched their instruments anxiously as the plane pulled out of its descent and began rocketing skyways. Captain slammed the engines to maximum thrust and brought the plane's nose to 20 degrees above the horizon. He was now carrying out the terrain escape maneuver, a close cousin of the winter escape maneuver he had been planning to use all day. The passengers clung to their seats, some screaming as the plane shook its engines, roaring. Within seconds, the plane was shooting upwards at a rate of more than 8,000 feet per minute. It was pandemonium for everyone on board. After a few tense moments, the plane was safely away from the water. The captain eased forwards on the control column, reduced power on the engines, and re-established the plane on its normal climb profile. The 2 pilots were shaken. They were the only ones on board who had a full sense of what had just happened. The past news and flight attendants knew that something unusual had taken place, but they had no idea quite how close they had come to disaster. Once the captain had the lead flight attendant confirmed that none of the passengers were injured and that there appeared to be no damage to the aircraft, he decided to continue the flight to San Francisco. 4.5 hours later, after landing at San Francisco, the pilots reported the incident to United Airlines. But incredibly, we wouldn't even know about it were it not for the fact that it was stumbled upon 2 months after it had taken place on Flight Radar 24. And reported on by the aviation news site, the air current United Airlines had determined that the incident didn't need to be reported to the National Transportation Safety Board because it didn't meet their reporting criteria, which stated that somebody had to have been injured or that there had to have been damage to the aircraft. By this point, the corporate voice recorder had long been overwritten as a result of this incident. The pilots of the fight were given additional training. But a question remains as to whether this is enough to prevent similar occurrences in future. Is this near disaster a once-off, or combined with a strikingly similar event involving a Qatar Airways Boeing 787 in January of 2023 and an Emirates 777 incident in December of 2021, which I've covered on this channel? Is it reasonable to ask whether these failures in basic airmanship are symptoms of a broader issue in pilot training and airline practice? Is this just the tip of the iceberg? The near crash of Flight 1722 is a lesson in how quickly things can go wrong in an aircraft, even with all of the modern safeguards against accidents. A simple loss of situational awareness by the captain, combined with poor weather, somewhat unusual aircraft configuration, and the miscommunication around flap setting, nearly caused a disaster. If this fight had taken place at nighttime, or if the cloud base had been lower, or if the captain had reacted even just seconds later than he did, this could very well have become the single worst air disaster in U.S. history by passenger fatalities. It's an open question as to whether the right lessons will be taken from this and other similar incidents in recent years. or whether it will take something more serious to spur the action required if you enjoyed this video, then you can get early access to ad-free videos here. And if you'd like to watch more, there's a playlist just here. Thanks for watching, and see you for the next video.